China started burying plants in the middle of the desert. No rain, no soil, just sand and wind. Experts laughed, calling it pointless and wasteful. Trees died, money vanished. Then satellites began showing something impossible. The desert wasn't growing anymore. It was turning green. China buried plants in the desert, and the world laughed. When China first announced its plan to bury straw, plants, and seedlings directly into the barren expanse of the Gobi Desert, the global reaction was a mixture of disbelief and ridicule. Experts scoffed at the idea of planting life where rainfall is almost non-existent. Critics called it symbolic theater, environmental window dressing, and a waste of resources. To anyone who understood deserts, this made no sense. Winds in the region can blow with such ferocity that they erase roads and bury villages overnight. Every year, the Gobi expanded by thousands of square kilometers, swallowing farmland and threatening cities. China's proposals seemed almost naive. How could saplings take root in sand so dry it felt like dust in the mouth? How could plants survive winds that pack enough force to strip soil bare? Skeptics joked that China was staging an environmental art installation rather than a serious ecological intervention. Even respected scientists raised eyebrows. This won't last a season, one critic predicted. Plants don't belong here. In the early days, the project was dismissed as folly, something for propaganda reels rather than scientific journals. Local farmers were among the first skeptics. They watched as saplings withered under brutal sun and brutal winds. Villagers whispered that the plan was destined to join a long history of impractical dreams. International media seized on these failures, labeling China's effort green theater, a well-intentioned but ultimately futile attempt to stop nature itself. Yet the seeds kept being planted. Straw mats, used to trap moisture and hold the soil in place, were laid by hand in meticulously spaced grids. Millions of seedlings went into the ground despite drought and scorching heat. Soldiers, students, and ordinary citizens turned out for National Tree Planting Day, spurred by government campaigns that made restoring the land a matter of national pride. What the world thought was a symbolic gesture was, in fact, the first step in something far bigger than anyone anticipated. The critics didn't just doubt the method, they underestimated the scale of commitment and adaptation that would be required. And as time passed, early failures would lay the groundwork for a deeper understanding. You don't conquer the desert by forcing nature. You work with it. The transformation had barely begun, but already what looked like a laughable idea was starting to show cracks in the global narrative about desertification and human ingenuity, when the desert became a national threat. By the late 20th century, desertification in northern China was no longer a distant problem. It was a national crisis. The desert's relentless creep had turned fertile valleys into barren plains. Once productive agricultural regions shrank year after year, leaving behind dry, cracked earth where wheat and barley fields once flourished. By 2000, roughly one-third of China's land had been affected by desertification, threatening food security, livelihoods, and entire communities. The Gobi Desert in particular was advancing like a slow, suffocating tide. Far from being an isolated environmental issue, its effects reached far beyond the borders of rural villages. Massive sandstorms became terrifying seasonal events. Cities like Beijing and Tianjin were blanketed in dust so thick that daylight dimmed, schools closed, and respiratory illnesses spiked. These storms carried dust clouds that traveled thousands of kilometers, reaching Japan and even the western coast of the United States, evidence of how far human impacts can travel. For the people living on the front lines, the toll was personal. Farms that once supported generations turned to dust. Water sources dried up or became contaminated. As livelihoods disappeared, entire families were forced to pack up their lives and move, or risk starvation. These people came to be known as ecological migrants, citizens displaced not by war or politics, but by the collapse of their own environment. For a rising global power like China, these weren't just statistics, they were threats to stability. Desertification contributed to shifting rainfall patterns, threatened grain production, and increased public health costs due to polluted air. At its worst, the sandstorms became political issues, with neighboring countries complaining about dust drifting across borders. The ideological stakes were high. A nation that had lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty could not afford to lose ground, literally and figuratively, to shifting sand. Government leaders realized that piecemeal, short-term measures wouldn't work. What was needed was an effort as monumental as the problem itself, a strategy that could slow, halt, and reverse the advance of the desert. This realization marked a turning point. Desertification was no longer a remote ecological problem. It had become a national threat, one that challenged China's economic growth, public health, social stability, and global reputation. For the first time, the desert wasn't just nature. It was an enemy that must be fought, repelled, and transformed. And that fight would lead to one of the largest ecological programs in human history. The Great Green Wall, a plan bigger than the desert. In 1978, China launched the Three North Shelter Forest Program, or Great Green Wall, an ambitious attempt to stop desertification by building a living barrier of trees across the country's arid north. Stretching from Dongbei to Xinjiang, the project aimed to restore 35 million hectares of degraded land over 73 years. Skeptics called it unrealistic. After all, planting trees in deserts battered by wind and drought seemed destined to fail. But what set this project apart was national mobilization. Soldiers, students, farmers, and officials took part, planting, watering, and protecting seedlings year after year. This was more than planting trees. It was an act of environmental defense, a shield against sandstorms, soil loss, and ecological collapse. Still, as the years went on, the real challenge became clear. Planting trees wasn't enough. Nature demanded understanding, not just ambition. And what followed would force China to evolve its strategy or watch it all fail. Early failure, when trees died by the millions. In the early years of China's desert restoration campaign, optimism quickly met harsh reality. Millions of trees, mostly fast-growing species like poplar and pine, were planted across northern deserts. But survival rates plummeted. In some regions, less than 20% of trees survived their first year. Wind-blown sand buried saplings, drought dried their roots, and the trees meant to heal the land began draining precious groundwater, worsening local shortages. Satellite images revealed ghost forests, dead plantations stripped bare by shifting dunes. The media mocked the effort, labeling it green theater, an expensive show of environmentalism without substance. Foreign critics said China was planting trees where trees could not live. But these failures weren't wasted. They exposed flawed assumptions and forced scientists to rethink their approach. Instead of clinging to failing methods, China's desert teams pivoted. The realization dawned, trees alone can't fix a desert. This bitter lesson would ultimately reshape the entire strategy and pave the way for success. The turning point. Learning the desert's rules. The early failures of vast monoculture plantations forced China's scientists and planners to rethink everything. It became clear that simply planting a lot of trees wasn't enough. The real lesson was that the desert had its own rules, and those rules couldn't be ignored. What worked in fertile farmland regions couldn't be directly transplanted to barren sand and shifting dunes. Instead of counting how many trees were planted, researchers began focusing on which plants could survive. The strategy shifted from sheer quantity to quality and ecology. Deep studies were launched into native vegetation that had evolved to endure harsh conditions over millennia. Trees and plants that had natural drought tolerance, like native shrubs, grasses, and hardy bushes, started replacing thirsty, fast-growing species that had failed. The project also began placing greater emphasis on soil stabilization and ecosystem balance rather than simply creating forest blankets. Grasslands were restored and mixed plant communities were introduced to mimic natural ecosystems rather than artificial plantations. These diverse systems proved far more resilient because they worked with the existing biology of the desert instead of against it. Another major change was moving away from poplars and pines alone toward combinations of shrubs and grasses that more effectively trapped moisture and reduced wind erosion. With deeper root systems and better adaptations, these species held ground even under relentless wind. This shift marked a philosophical transformation. It was no longer about conquering the desert. It was about understanding it, working with the environment, not against it. This new approach didn't just improve survival rates, it began to show measurable impacts. Vegetation started returning not just in planted plots, but spreading beyond them, showing signs of natural regeneration. China was still far from winning its battle with the desert, but it had finally stopped losing. The lesson was clear. You don't defeat nature by force. You adapt to its logic. The straw checkerboard, the idea that changed everything. After years of failed tree plantations, China's scientists realized the real enemy wasn't just drought. It was wind. Strong winds picked up loose sand and battered saplings before they could take root. The solution wasn't stronger trees. It was a smart pattern, the straw checkerboard. Workers laid rice straw bundles in grid patterns across huge dunes, forming millions of tiny squares. This grid didn't stop the wind, it slowed it down. Each straw square acted like a tiny windbreak, trapping sand and stopping it from shifting. Instead of trying to plant directly into drifting dunes, workers stabilized the ground first. Rice straw was the perfect material because China produced so much of it. Before this, most straw was burned as agricultural waste. Now it became a weapon against desertification. People worked under blazing sun and blowing sand, embedding straw into the desert floor one square at a time. The effect was dramatic. Where grids were placed, sand movement dropped sharply, wind erosion weakened, moisture stayed in the soil longer. Seeds had a fighting chance. For the first time, the desert stopped advancing in measurable ways. The straw checkerboard wasn't glamorous, but it worked, and it marked a turning point from random planting to strategic ecological engineering. This wasn't about overpowering nature. It was about working with desert dynamics to slow what once seemed unstoppable. Science beneath the sand, rebuilding soil from nothing. Stabilizing sand was only half the battle. To truly transform desert wasteland into living land, China's scientists aimed to rebuild soil itself, turning sterile sand into something capable of supporting life. The key was combining smart materials with ecological insight. First came biochar, charcoal made from agricultural waste. Mixed into desert sand, it created tiny pores that could hold water and nutrients that would otherwise evaporate or wash away. Next, compost and clay were blended in, giving the soil structure and feeding young plants. But perhaps the biggest breakthrough came from harnessing microbial fungi. These tiny organisms form partnerships with plant roots, helping them absorb water and nutrients while also binding soil particles together. The result was soil that didn't just sit there. It began to act more like fertile earth. Precision drip irrigation was a game changer. Instead of flooding dry ground and losing most of the water to evaporation, tiny tubes delivered moisture straight to the roots. This saved vast amounts of water and made every drop count. Technology supported these ecological advances. Drones and satellites monitored vegetation growth and soil changes in real time, guiding where to plant, water, or reinforce soil improvement efforts. Within a few seasons, something remarkable happened. Soil that once looked lifeless began gaining organic matter and stability. Plants grew where none had before. Seeds sprouted into grasses and shrubs. What had been barren sand was becoming fertile ground, not by accident, but by design. Engineering meets ecology, taming the wind. Desert winds once buried infrastructure and erased roads. But as China's greening efforts progressed, engineering joined ecology to control the wind itself. Instead of fighting nature head-on, planners used vegetation and landscape design to absorb and deflect sand. One of the most critical applications was along transportation corridors. Roads and railways that used to be overrun with drifting sand became stable when vegetation corridors were planted along their sides. These living fences slowed wind at the surface, reducing blowing sand and protecting vital infrastructure. Simple engineering tools complemented these green barriers. Straw grids were paired with gravel belts to anchor large areas of soil. Windbreak forests, lines of hardy shrubs and trees, slowed winds long before they hit exposed ground. These combined systems work like a series of nested defenses, each reducing wind speed and trapping dust and sand. One remarkable success was the highway across the Taklamakan Desert, once considered impossible to maintain. With straw grids, windbreaks, and coordinated planting, the road now stands clear of burial, even through severe wind events. Mechanization also accelerated progress. Specialized machines now install grid systems faster than manual labor ever could, covering far greater swaths of shifting dunes. This fusion of engineering and ecology didn't just slow the wind, it reshaped the landscape. What was once a source of destruction became part of a growing, managed environment where soil, plants, and infrastructure coexist. China wasn't simply planting trees anymore. It was building a wind-resistant world. The results no one expected. By the 2020s, what had once seemed impossible was now undeniable. More than 30 million hectares of desert-affected land had been reclaimed, stabilized, or rejuvenated. Where sand once ruled, grasses, shrubs, and forests now held ground. Forest coverage across China climbed from about 10% in 1949 to over 25%, a remarkable ecological shift. This wasn't just about trees, it was about functional ecosystems that support soil health, water retention, and biodiversity. With vegetation in place, dust storms, once annual spectacles that darkened skies and disrupted lives, were sharply reduced. Cities like Beijing and Tianjin, long accustomed to yellow haze and choking windblown dust, began seeing clearer skies with fewer severe storms. Wildlife too made a comeback. Birds, insects, and small mammals returned to regions once barren and lifeless. These animals helped further stabilize soils and spread seeds, accelerating a recovery beyond what human planning alone could achieve. Communities living on the edges of deserts noticed real change. Where families once feared sand-swallowing homes, they now saw grasslands and crops returning. New economic opportunities emerged. Goji berry farms, medicinal herbs, ecotourism, and sustainable grazing lands provided income and revitalized rural areas. This transformation wasn't just measurable in hectares or statistics. It was visible from space. Satellites captured wide ribbons of green radiating outward where nothing but dust and sand had existed before. What was once mocked as a naive plan had become an ecological success story that defied expectations and proved that even the harshest landscapes can be changed with persistence, strategy, and science. From mockery to model, a lesson for the world. China's desert transformation didn't just change its own landscape, it shifted global thinking about dryland restoration. NASA and other international agencies documented a significant increase in global greening, much of it attributed to China's planting and land restoration efforts. Where critics once saw vanity projects, scientists now saw data. Earth's surface was becoming greener, and China was one of the largest contributors. Beyond carbon calculations and increased vegetation index scores, this greening had real climate implications. Restored land captured more atmospheric carbon, improved soil moisture, and reduced dust aerosol impact, contributing to better air quality and local climate stabilization. Other nations began paying attention. Countries in Africa's Sahel, the Middle East, and Central Asia faced similar desertification pressures. China's low-cost solutions, straw grids, native species planting, soil rebuilding techniques, and community mobilization became case studies for dryland restoration programs abroad. International delegations visited restored regions to see the techniques in action. Universities and environmental organizations began training workshops in arid regions worldwide. Far from being an isolated national experiment, China's methods became part of a global toolkit against desertification. The lesson was clear. It wasn't about defeating the desert. It was about teaching it to live again by working with its climate, soil, and winds rather than fighting them. What once drew laughter became a model of resilience and an example that even the toughest environments can respond to thoughtful, sustained human effort. What the world mocked became a blueprint. China didn't defeat the desert. It learned how to live with it.